When someone says prehistory, the image that appears in the mind is almost always the same. A Tyrannosaurus rex standing over a dramatic landscape, or a Brachiosaurus stretching its neck toward treetops, or a herd of Triceratops crossing a plain beneath a stormy sky. Dinosaurs have become the universal symbol of ancient life, the default representation of a world before ours. And that is understandable. They dominated the planet for 180 million years, left fossils on every continent, and inspired a fascination that 150 years of modern paleontology has not exhausted. There is another way to feel the history that preceded the dinosaurs that requires no map and no data. Simply look at any rock face exposed by a road cut or a river cliff and count the layers. Each visible layer represents a period of time. The layers below the dinosaur-bearing strata represent all the time before the dinosaurs. And there are many of them. Many more than the layers above. The visible geometry of the rock record is a direct representation of temporal proportions. What came before the dinosaurs is a much thicker pile of time than what came after. The 5 major mass extinctions of the last 500 million years, the Big Five, are the punctuation marks in the story of life before the dinosaurs. Each one reset the ecological playing field and opened opportunities for new groups that had previously been constrained by competition with established dominance. The Gorgonopsids would not have dominated the Permian if earlier extinctions had not cleared space for the synapsids. The dinosaurs would not have dominated the Jurassic if the Permian-Triassic and Triassic-Jurassic extinctions had not successively cleared their competitors. And the mammals would not dominate today if the end Cretaceous extinction had not cleared the dinosaurs. The history of life is not a smooth, progressive story. It is a series of explosions of diversification followed by catastrophic contractions, with each contraction setting the stage for the next explosion. The fossil record of life before the dinosaurs is not empty or sparse. It is rich with organisms of every conceivable shape and strategy, many of them so strange that paleontologists still debate their basic biology and relationships. The Cambrian explosion, the rapid diversification of animal body plans that occurred 540 million years ago, produced forms like the Hallucigenia, a creature that looked like a walking cactus, or the Opabinia, with 5 eyes and a clawed proboscis, or the Anomalocaris, a half-meter predator with compound eyes and grasping appendages that make it look like something from a science fiction film. All of those lived and died and left their fossils in rocks that were already ancient by the time the first dinosaur evolved. But dinosaurs were not always there. Before the dinosaurs, Earth was inhabited by entire worlds that almost no one knows. Worlds with their own dominant creatures, their own apex predators, their own complex and rich ecosystems. Worlds that existed for periods of time as long or longer than the age of the dinosaurs. Worlds that in some cases nearly wiped all life from the planet before dinosaurs even had the chance to evolve. The age of the dinosaurs began approximately 230 million years ago, in the late Triassic. Before that moment, Earth had been in existence for more than 4 billion years, and for the last 500 million of those years had been filling that time with complex and extraordinary life. Before the dinosaurs, there were giant amphibians that dominated the swamps of the Carboniferous. There were synapsid predators with saber teeth that hunted on the plains of the Permian. There were forests of trees with no equivalent in any period before or after. There were seas full of creatures that left no descendants in the modern world. Tonight we are going to explore that time. Not the time of the dinosaurs, which many already know, but the time that came before. The time that had to exist, develop, fail, and nearly disappear completely for the dinosaurs to finally emerge from the wreckage. Because the dinosaurs were not the beginning of life's story on Earth. They were one of its later chapters, preceded by hundreds of millions of years of equally extraordinary history. There is a useful statistic for putting in perspective what we are going to explore tonight. Non-avian dinosaurs, that is, dinosaurs that are not birds, existed for approximately 180 million years. That is an immense time compared to human history. But it is only the last 35% of the time that vertebrates have been on land. The remaining 65%, the 350 million years before the first dinosaurs, is filled with equally extraordinary life. And if we include marine life before the conquest of land, the numbers become even more impressive. The first animals with hard skeletons appeared approximately 540 million years ago in the Cambrian. Before that, there were another 80 million years of soft-bodied multicellular animals that rarely fossilize. And before the first multicellular animals, more than 3 billion years of microbial life. The dinosaurs are recent on that scale. They are practically the newcomers. Understanding that does not diminish the dinosaurs. They remain extraordinary. But it opens a perspective in which the dinosaurs are an episode within a much longer story, a story that began with the first microbes in Earth's primitive oceans and that continues today in the biosphere we inhabit. We are part of that story. And tonight we are going to explore the chapters that came before the dinosaurs. Settle in. We are going to travel very far back. To understand what existed before the dinosaurs, you have to understand the Permian. The Permian period is the last period of the Paleozoic era and lasted from approximately 290 million years ago until 252 million years ago. It is a period that almost never appears in popular documentaries about prehistory, eclipsed by the more famous periods that came before and after. But it was one of the most fascinating periods in the history of life, with a cast of animals that has no equivalent in any other era. The therapsids of the Permian show in the fossil record a gradient of features that is one of the most instructive in all of evolutionary biology. The earliest and most primitive synapsids, like the Dimetrodon from the early Permian, had relatively primitive reptile-like features. The middle therapsids, like the Gorgonopsids and Dicynodonts of the late Permian, show increasingly mammalian characteristics in their teeth and skull structure. The advanced cynodonts of the Triassic are so close to mammals in their anatomy that classifying some of them as mammals or proto-mammals is a matter of where paleontologists choose to draw an arbitrary line. That gradient is not an artifact of incomplete fossil sampling. It is the actual evolutionary sequence, the step-by-step transformation that the fossil record preserves with extraordinary completeness in the rocks of the Karoo Basin of South Africa. The osteological evidence for mammal-like features in therapsids includes some of the most remarkable fossil sequences in all of paleontology. In the most primitive Permian synapsids, like the early Dimetrodon, the lower jaw is composed of multiple bones, as it is in reptiles. In the most advanced Triassic cynodonts, the lower jaw has been reduced to a single bone, the dentary, exactly as in modern mammals. The intermediate forms, the Gorgonopsids, Dicynodonts, Therocephalians, and various cynodont grades, show every intermediate state between the multiple bone jaw of reptiles and the single bone jaw of mammals. That sequence, preserved step by step in the rock record spanning tens of millions of years, is one of the most compelling direct demonstrations of evolution in the entire fossil record. The Karoo Basin, a geological formation covering hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of the South African landscape, contains one of the most complete records of life's transition from the Permian to the Triassic anywhere in the world. For over 150 years, paleontologists have been systematically collecting fossils from the red mudstones of the Karoo, building a picture of what lived, how it lived, and how it changed through the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history. The fossils found in the Karoo include virtually every group of Permian therapsids, including multiple species of Gorgonopsids, dozens of Dicynodont species, and the complete sequence of cynodont evolution from primitive Permian forms to advanced Triassic forms almost indistinguishable from mammals. The Permian world was the world of Pangaea at its maximum extent. A single enormous supercontinent surrounded by the Panthalassa Ocean, with an arid interior and relatively humid coasts. And in that world lived extraordinary animals belonging to the group that would eventually produce mammals, the synapsids. Synapsids are one of the most important groups in the history of vertebrates and one of the least known to the general public. They are not reptiles, though the most primitive looked superficially like reptiles. They are not mammals, though the most advanced had characteristics that approached those of mammals. They are something intermediate, a lineage that evolved independently for millions of years, developing its own solutions to the problems of a terrestrial predator or herbivore. In the late Permian, synapsids completely dominated the terrestrial ecosystems of Pangaea. The most fearsome group were the gorgonopsids, predators of variable size, from the size of a large dog to the size of a bear, with upper fangs that in the largest species reached 15 to 20 centimeters in length. Those fangs were not for biting and holding like a modern crocodile. They were for stabbing and tearing, for producing deep mortal wounds in prey much larger than themselves. Gorgonopsids were active hunters, probably capable of pursuing prey in short high-speed chases. The most common prey of the gorgonopsids were the dicynodonts, extremely abundant herbivores that in some Permian faunas represented most of the animal biomass. Dicynodonts had barrel-shaped bodies, short but robust limbs, and horny beaks similar to a turtle's but much larger. Some were small, the size of a rabbit. Others reached the dimensions of a hippopotamus. They lived in herds and fed on terrestrial vegetation, from ferns to the first conifers. A dicynodont could in principle walk from what is today Argentina to what is today China without getting wet except in the rivers along the way, because when those animals lived, all those continents were one. There were also smaller therapsids, some with features that clearly foreshadowed the future mammals. The differentiation of teeth into types with distinct functions, a more upright posture, possibly warm blood. The late Permian was, in many ways, the world of the proto-mammals, the evolutionary experiment that was building the mammalian body plan before anyone knew mammals were going to exist. There is a detail of gorgonopsid anatomy that is especially striking when studied closely: their teeth. The most primitive gorgonopsids had relatively uniform teeth, homodont like those of most modern reptiles. But the most advanced species from the late Permian showed clear differentiation. The enormous saber canines, smaller incisors at the front, and smaller post canines behind. That differentiation is the same we see in mammals, only at a more primitive stage of its evolutionary development. The gorgonopsids were on their way toward the mammalian type of dentition. They never completed that process. The Permian-Triassic extinction eliminated them before they could fully develop it. And then the end came. 252 million years ago, the world of the late Permian came to its end in the most violent way the history of life on Earth has recorded. The Permian-Triassic extinction, also called the Great Dying, was by far the most devastating extinction event of the last 500 million years. More severe than the event that killed the dinosaurs. More severe than any other mass extinction in the geological record. One remarkable aspect of the Permian-Triassic extinction boundary that paleontologists have documented in multiple sites around the world is the appearance of what geologists call the disaster fauna, a very limited assemblage of opportunistic species that proliferated in the ecological vacuum left by the extinction. Those disaster species include the Lystrosaurus on land, various bacteria-like organisms in the sea, and a small number of simple, generalist invertebrates in the marine realm. They are the species that were prepared by accident for extreme conditions, species whose modest ecological requirements and high reproductive rates allowed them to colonize a world where their competitors had been eliminated. The carbon isotope excursion that marks the Permian-Triassic boundary in marine sediments around the world is one of the largest and most rapid carbon isotope changes in the geological record. It records a massive and sudden addition of isotopically light carbon to the ocean atmosphere system, consistent with the rapid combustion of organic carbon in the form of coal beds that the Siberian lava flows overran, or with the release of methane from seafloor gas hydrates destabilized by warming. Either way, it represents an injection of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere on a scale that modern climate science finds sobering when contemplating what our own carbon emissions might trigger over much longer timescales. The disaster fauna of the early Triassic lasted for several million years before more diverse and specialized faunas began to replace it. That replacement was not smooth or gradual. It involved several secondary extinction events that temporarily reversed the recovery and kept diversity low even as conditions gradually improved. The full recovery of marine ecosystems, measured by species diversity, took approximately 10 million years. The full recovery of terrestrial ecosystems probably took a similar length of time, though the terrestrial record is less complete. The lesson the Permian-Triassic recovery teaches is that complex ecosystems, once dismantled, take geological time to rebuild. The relationships between species, the food webs, the nutrient cycles, all of those take millions of years to re-establish once they collapse. Estimates vary depending on the study and the method used, but most researchers agree that approximately 96% of all marine species and between 70 and 80% of all terrestrial vertebrate species were lost. In simpler terms, almost everything died. Ecosystems that had taken tens of millions of years to build collapsed in a period that in geological terms was nearly instantaneous, probably between 10,000 and 60,000 years. The primary cause was massive volcanism in what is today Siberia, in northwestern Russia. The Siberian Traps, a series of continental-scale volcanic eruptions that lasted several 100,000 years, released into the atmosphere quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide that produced a cascade of devastating effects. Severe global warming, ocean acidification, acid rain that destroyed terrestrial vegetation, depletion of dissolved oxygen in marine water. The planet was left in conditions that most complex organisms could not tolerate. What is especially striking about the geological record of that extinction is the speed of the collapse. In many sites around the world, there are rock layers that show a diverse and abundant Permian fauna, and then, just a few centimeters higher in the stratigraphy, practically nothing. That transition can represent barely tens of thousands of years, a whisper in geological terms. Life on Earth went from being a complex and rich system to being on the verge of total extinction in a period that, on the scale of life's history, is practically instantaneous. The geochemical record of the extinction has been studied in sites around the world, and in each one the story told by the rocks is essentially the same. In southern China, in the Russian Arctic, in the mountains of South Africa, in the Italian Dolomites, there is a layer of rock marking the Permian-Triassic boundary that in all those places shows the same pattern: a diverse and abundant Permian fauna in the strata below, and practically nothing in the strata above for several meters of thickness. A consequence of the Permian-Triassic extinction that is rarely mentioned is the effect it had on freshwater ecosystems. While marine and terrestrial ecosystems were collapsing, freshwater bodies, rivers, lakes, and floodplains appear to have acted as refuges where some animal groups survived in better condition than in open marine or terrestrial environments. Some groups of freshwater fish, several groups of amphibians, and the first archosauromorphs, the primitive ancestors of the archosaurs, may have survived better in freshwater environments precisely because those environments were somewhat more isolated from changes in global ocean chemistry and the destruction of terrestrial vegetation. The gorgonopsids disappeared completely. Not one survived. That lineage of predators that had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for millions of years was erased from Earth without leaving any descendants. The dicynodonts suffered an almost equally devastating loss, though a few species survived to populate the early Triassic. Marine ecosystems were hit even harder than terrestrial ones. The reefs disappeared, the continental shelves were laid bare, the seas filled with dead zones where oxygen was insufficient for any complex animal. The Permian-Triassic extinction was not just the end of the animals living at that time. It was the end of the first great era of terrestrial vertebrates, the evolutionary experiment that had lasted since animals left the water. What came after had to start almost from scratch. The world that followed the Permian-Triassic extinction was a strange and disturbed place. The early Triassic, the first 5 to 10 million years of the Triassic period, is one of the most unusual intervals in the geological record. The rocks of that period contain signals of extreme conditions: very high temperatures, low oxygen levels in the seas, eroded soils without vegetation to protect them, river systems transporting enormous quantities of sediment to the oceans because the banks no longer had plants to retain them. The period immediately after the Permian-Triassic extinction also witnessed something unexpected in the terrestrial record: a return to simpler soil structures. Modern soils are complex systems built up by roots, burrowing animals, and decomposing organic material over thousands of years. The soils of the latest Permian, just before the extinction, were correspondingly complex, with abundant root traces, burrow systems, and organic matter. The soils of the earliest Triassic, immediately after the extinction, are much simpler, with few root traces and almost no burrowing activity. The destruction of terrestrial vegetation by the extinction event left the land surface almost bare, and without roots to hold the soil in place, erosion dramatically increased. River systems changed their character, from the meandering rivers typical of stable, vegetated landscapes to the braided systems typical of areas with sparse vegetation and high sediment loads. Those changes in river style are another of the geological signals recording the devastation of terrestrial ecosystems at the end of the Permian. The recovery of terrestrial ecosystems after the Permian-Triassic extinction was not uniform across the planet. Different regions recovered at different rates, depending on local conditions, the composition of the surviving fauna and flora, and the severity of the initial extinction at that particular location. Some regions seem to have recovered relatively quickly, within a few million years, while others remained in a depauperate state for longer. That geographic variation in recovery rate suggests that the early Triassic was a world of ecological patches, some already rebuilding diversity while others were still inhabited by the disaster fauna. Those patches of faster recovery may have been the source populations from which diversity spread to repopulate more devastated regions as conditions improved. The geological record of the early Triassic recovery also preserves evidence of unusual chemical conditions in the oceans that help explain why recovery was so slow. Widespread seafloor anoxia, the absence of oxygen in bottom waters, is documented by black organic-rich shales deposited over large areas of the early Triassic seafloor. Under anoxic conditions, the seafloor becomes inhospitable for most benthic organisms, those living on or in the sediment, which normally play crucial roles in bioturbating the sediment and cycling nutrients. Without those bioturbators, the seafloor became a chemically stratified, sulfide-rich environment that only specialized anaerobic microbes could exploit. The restoration of oxygenated bottom water conditions, which took several million years after the extinction, was a precondition for the return of diverse benthic communities. The recovery of terrestrial vegetation, which had to precede the recovery of terrestrial animal diversity, was led by the first pioneer plants tolerant of the disturbed post-extinction conditions. Ferns, which are classic pioneer colonizers after disturbances in modern ecosystems as well, seem to have played a similar role in the early Triassic recovery. The earliest Triassic plant records in some regions are dominated by fern spores, suggesting that ferns were among the first plants to recolonize the bare landscapes left by the extinction. As soils stabilized and conditions improved, more complex vegetation with trees and larger plants gradually replaced those pioneer fern communities. Biological diversity was at its lowest point in hundreds of millions of years. The few species that survived the extinction found themselves in a world with abundant resources and scarce competitors, which produced massive proliferations of the most successful survivors. The Lystrosaurus, a medium-sized dicynodont with the appearance of a cross between a hippopotamus and a turtle, became the most abundant terrestrial vertebrate on the planet for the first millions of years of the Triassic. Its fossils appear in enormous quantities in early Triassic strata of every continent that was then part of Pangaea. In the seas, microbial mats, Structures formed by bacterial communities that today we find only in very specific environments proliferated again as they had in the times before complex life. Without the animals that normally grazed on them and kept them under control, the mats covered the seafloors like a green and gray carpet. It is one of the clearest signs of how deep the collapse was. The world temporarily returned to a state reminiscent of the Precambrian, when microbes dominated and animals did not yet exist. The recovery was slow and uneven. For several million years after the extinction, species diversity remained far below late Permian levels. New species that evolved during that time tended to be small, generalist, capable of surviving in variable environmental conditions. Extreme specialization, which before the Permian-Triassic had produced the gorgonopsids and other highly specialized predators, was too risky in a world still unstable. The early Triassic also witnessed the reappearance of a type of marine sediment called stromatolite, which today is extremely rare but which in Precambrian times, when microbes dominated the oceans, was tremendously abundant. Stromatolites are laminated structures produced by microbial community activity, mainly cyanobacteria, that grow in layers and trap sediment. Their reappearance in the early Triassic is another signal that the marine world temporarily returned to a state resembling the Precambrian, with microbes dominating in the absence of the animals that normally control them. But life never completely stops. In the margins, in the refuges, in the environments where conditions were less extreme, the groups that would survive to build the Middle and Late Triassic world were taking their first steps. The archosaurs, the group that would eventually produce both the dinosaurs and the crocodiles and birds, began to diversify. The first true mammals were only a few million years away. And in the seas, the first ichthyosaurs were beginning their extraordinary transformation from terrestrial animals to specialized oceanic swimmers. The world was empty, and life was beginning to fill it again. Among the forms of life beginning to diversify within the Triassic after the extinction, there was a group that would prove to be one of the most important in all of vertebrate history. The archosaurs, whose name literally means ruling reptiles, are the group that includes the dinosaurs, modern birds, crocodilians, and several extinct groups of Mesozoic reptiles. They are, along with the mammals, one of the two lineages of vertebrates that dominate today's terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. The question of whether the first dinosaurs were warm-blooded, endothermic like modern birds and mammals, or cold-blooded, ectothermic like modern reptiles, has been one of the most contentious in paleontology for decades and is directly relevant to understanding why dinosaurs ultimately succeeded where cruratarsans failed. The answer is now believed to be somewhere in between, or more precisely, that different groups of early dinosaurs had different metabolic rates, but that even the earliest dinosaurs probably had higher metabolic rates than typical modern reptiles. The diversity of archosaur groups in the Triassic also included several fascinating forms that do not fit neatly into either the cruratarsan or ornithodontan branches. The proterocampsids were semi-aquatic archosaurs that resembled small crocodilians. The lagerpetids, long known only from fragmentary remains, have recently been identified through better specimens as close relatives of the pterosaurs. The silesaurids, once thought to be early dinosaurs, are now understood to be a sister group to the dinosaurs that evolved many dinosaur-like features independently. That diversity of non-dinosaur, non-cruratarsan archosaurs illustrates how rich and complex the archosaur radiation of the Triassic was, producing multiple groups that would prove evolutionary dead ends alongside the two lineages, the cruratarsans leading to crocodilians and the ornithodonts leading to pterosaurs and dinosaurs, that would survive into the Jurassic and beyond. Evidence for elevated dinosaur metabolism comes from the bone growth patterns visible in fossilized dinosaur bone. Modern reptiles grow slowly throughout their lives, and their bones show laminar growth patterns reflecting that slow, continuous growth. Modern birds and mammals grow rapidly early in life and then stop growing, and their bones show fibrolamellar bone tissue with rapid deposition. Many Triassic and Jurassic dinosaur bones show fibrolamellar tissue, suggesting that even early dinosaurs grew rapidly in their early years, which is typically associated with high metabolic rates. If early dinosaurs had higher metabolic rates than their crurotarsan competitors, that could have given them advantages in activity level, endurance, and ecological flexibility that contributed to their survival when the Triassic-Jurassic extinction struck. Archosaurs evolved in the early Triassic, probably from ancestors that survived the Permian-Triassic extinction among the more primitive groups of reptiles. Their earliest forms were small and generalist, difficult to distinguish from other early Triassic reptiles in many respects. But they had a combination of characteristics that would make them extraordinarily successful. A limb arrangement that could evolve toward the fully upright posture typical of dinosaurs, a lung capacity that could be improved toward the highly efficient respiratory system of birds, and a morphological flexibility that would allow enormous diversification over tens of millions of years. Within the archosaurs, a fundamental division appeared early. On one side were the cruratarsans, the lineage that would lead to modern crocodilians and their extinct relatives. On the other were the ornithodorans, the lineage that would lead to the pterosaurs and the dinosaurs. That division occurred early in the Triassic, and the two branches followed distinct evolutionary paths throughout that period. During the Triassic, the cruratarsans were the dominant group. They were more diverse than the ornithodorans, occupied more ecological niches, and had produced the largest terrestrial predators in the world. The Rauisuchians were the great predators of the Triassic, with bodies up to 6 or 7 meters long, walking with limbs more upright than most reptiles of their era. The Aetosaur were armored herbivores with bodies covered in bony plates that gave them a vague resemblance to a giant armadillo. The Phytosaurs, which resembled modern crocodilians remarkably closely, dominated Triassic rivers and lakes. The upright posture of the dinosaurs, that characteristic distinguishing them from most reptiles and that was fundamental to their evolutionary success, evolved within the archosaurs during the Triassic. The cruratarsans, the archosaurs that did not lead to dinosaurs but to crocodilians, also developed relatively upright forms during the Triassic. The Rauisuchians walked with their limbs somewhat more beneath their body than most reptiles, though not as vertical as dinosaurs. That suggests the tendency toward upright posture was a general adaptation within the archosaurs, not specific to dinosaurs. In the Triassic world dominated by cruratarsans, the first dinosaurs appeared as modest animals, relatively small, that initially occupied secondary niches without being the dominant predators or herbivores of their ecosystems. The story of the dinosaurs does not begin with a triumphant entrance. It begins as many stories of evolutionary success begin, in the margins, almost unnoticed, waiting for the moment when circumstances change in their favor. That moment would come, but not yet. Before it arrived, the Triassic had its own story to tell. The Triassic is one of the least known periods in the history of life, which is surprising given that it witnessed some of the most dramatic changes in the evolution of terrestrial vertebrates. It is the period in which the first dinosaurs appeared, the first pterosaurs, the first mammals, the first ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. It is the period of recovery after the most devastating extinction in the history of life. And it is the period that ended with another mass extinction that opened the way for the age of the dinosaurs. The Triassic also produced the most spectacular diversification of marine vertebrates seen since the initial conquest of the sea by vertebrates hundreds of millions of years earlier. The ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and other marine reptile groups were the product of a series of independent recolonizations of the sea by terrestrial vertebrate lineages, each of which convergently evolved adaptations for aquatic life. That convergence is one of the clearest demonstrations of how reliably natural selection produces similar solutions to similar problems. The streamlined body, the flipper-like limbs, the tail flukes, appeared repeatedly and independently in unrelated lineages that all returned to the sea. The Triassic fauna of the American Southwest is particularly well documented because the Chinle Formation, the late Triassic geological unit covering much of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, has been studied intensively since the 19th century. The iconic red rock landscapes of the Colorado Plateau, including the spectacular badlands and mesas seen in many famous scenic areas, are largely the product of Chinle Formation rocks eroding into their current forms. Those same rocks contain the fossils of a complete late Triassic ecosystem. Phytosaurs in the rivers, Aetosaur on the floodplains, Rawasuchians as top predators, early dinosaurs as secondary predators, and a diverse supporting cast of smaller reptiles, amphibians, and early mammals. The late Triassic of the American Southwest was an ecological world of considerable richness, and its remains are literally exposed in some of the most scenic landscapes in the United States. The pterosaurs, the first vertebrate flyers, also appeared in the Triassic and represent another of the group's extraordinary innovations. Their wings were built around an enormously elongated fourth finger supporting a membrane of skin stretched to the body and hind leg, a completely different wing architecture from those of birds and bats. Whether pterosaurs were active flyers capable of soaring and maneuvering like modern birds, or more limited gliders, is still debated. But their success is not. They dominated the skies for over 160 million years, from the Triassic to the very end of the Cretaceous, and during that time produced forms ranging from sparrow-sized species to the Quetzalcoatlus with its 10 to 12-meter wingspan, the largest flying animal that ever existed. Between the unstable early years of the early Triassic and the late Triassic extinction, there was a rich and diverse middle and late Triassic, with its own cast of extraordinary animals. The Rawasuchians, those great crurotarsan predators mentioned earlier, reached their most impressive forms in the late Triassic. Saurosuchus galilei from South America reached 7 meters in length and was probably the largest terrestrial predator of its time. Postosuchus from North America was equally formidable, with a large skull and blade-shaped teeth designed for cutting flesh. The Ghost Ranch fossil site in New Mexico is one of the most extraordinary in all of Triassic paleontology and deserves special mention. More than 1,000 specimens of the dinosaur Coelophysis baueri have been found there, many in exceptional preservation that allows studying the anatomy of this primitive animal with a detail rarely possible at other Triassic sites. The accumulation of so many individuals in the same place suggests that an entire population of Coelophysis died in a single catastrophic event, probably a sudden flood during the dry season when the river rose again. The late Triassic fauna of North America has also yielded other important fossils for understanding the period immediately before the dinosaur evolutionary explosion. The Chinle Formation, which outcrops across vast areas of the American Southwest, contains fossils of a mixed fauna of dinosaurs and crurotarsans that perfectly illustrates the transitional state of late Triassic ecosystems, still dominated by crurotarsans but with dinosaurs already present and beginning to diversify. That fauna is the snapshot of a world in transition, just before the event that would change everything. These early dinosaurs of the late Triassic are in many ways the most interesting from an evolutionary standpoint, though they are rarely the most visually spectacular. They were dinosaurs in their most primitive form, before evolution took them to the gigantic sizes and extreme specializations of the Jurassic and Cretaceous. The Eoraptor lunensis, discovered in the Esquigualasto Formation of Argentina and dated to approximately 231 million years ago, was small, approximately 1 meter in length, with teeth in the jaws suggesting an omnivorous diet. The Herrerasaurus was somewhat larger and clearly carnivorous. None of those early dinosaurs would have seemed particularly impressive compared to a Saurosuchus or Postosuchus. But in their genes was already written the entire future of the dinosaur era. The Triassic ended approximately 201 million years ago with the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, which eliminated most of the large crurotarsans and completely reorganized Pangaea's terrestrial ecosystems. The Rawasuchians disappeared. The phytosaurs went extinct. The Aetosaur ceased to exist. And the dinosaurs, which survived that extinction better than their competitors, began the evolutionary explosion that would fill the Jurassic and Cretaceous. While the great reptiles of the Triassic dominated the visible scene, something important was happening at the margins. Small animals, mostly nocturnal, that hid in rock cracks and fallen logs during the day and came out to hunt insects and small invertebrates when darkness fell. Animals that most of the Triasic's great predators would have completely ignored, too small to be prey worth pursuing. The nocturnal lifestyle of early mammals left physical traces in their biology that persist in their descendants today. Mammals have a relatively poor color vision compared to birds or reptiles. Most reptiles have 4 types of color photoreceptors, while most placental mammals have only 2. That reduction in color vision is believed to be the result of millions of years of nocturnal life during the age of the dinosaurs, when the ability to see colors in the dark was of little use and color receptors could be replaced by receptors more sensitive to dim light. Primates, including humans, re-evolved trichromatic vision relatively recently, but most mammals remain dichromatic. The earliest mammals of the Triassic and Jurassic were not all alike despite their overall small size and presumed nocturnality. Even in that early period, different mammalian lineages were beginning to specialize for different ecological roles. Fossils from the Jurassic of China have revealed early mammals with diets and lifestyles far more varied than previously suspected. The Volaticotherium was an early gliding mammal. The Castorocauda was an otter-like swimmer. The Fruitifossor had specialized teeth for eating colonial insects, much like modern aardvarks. These discoveries have completely revised the traditional picture of all early mammals as uniform shrew-like insectivores, showing instead that mammalian ecological diversity began much earlier than previously thought, even while the dinosaurs were still dominant. The nocturnal mammals of the Mesozoic also developed another characteristic that would prove extremely important for their descendants: the capacity for extended parental care. Modern mammals invest enormous amounts of time and energy in caring for offspring after birth. That investment begins with lactation, feeding offspring with milk, which itself requires a long metabolic investment from the mother. The origins of lactation are not well preserved in the fossil record because milk glands leave no direct traces in bones, but indirect evidence suggests that even early Mesozoic mammals were already providing extended parental care compared to typical reptiles. That investment in individual offspring, producing fewer but more capable young rather than many offspring with little parental investment, was a strategy that would prove extraordinarily successful when the dinosaurs were gone and mammals had the ecological space to grow large and complex. In contrast, the sense of smell and hearing of mammals are extraordinarily developed compared to those of most reptiles. The olfactory bulb, the part of the brain processing smells, is proportionally much larger in mammals than in reptiles. The mammalian auditory system, with its middle ear of 3 tiny bones, is more sensitive and covers a wider frequency range than that of reptiles. Those sensory capabilities, perfect for nocturnal navigation and insect hunting in the dark, are also the legacy of millions of years of life in the shadows of the Mesozoic world. The deep evolutionary history of our sensory systems reaches back to the Triassic, to those small cynodont-descended animals that first learned to make the most of the night. Those animals were the first mammals. The first true mammals evolved during the late Triassic, between 225 and 210 million years ago, from a group of advanced therapsids called cynodonts. The cynodonts were the most mammal-like of all the therapsids that had survived the Permian-Triassic extinction, with teeth differentiated into incisors, canines, and molars, with a more upright posture than their ancestors, and possibly with fur and warm blood, though those characteristics are difficult to confirm directly in the fossil record. The transition from cynodont to mammal was gradual, as all evolutionary transitions are when seen with sufficient resolution. There is a series of late Triassic genera that sit in a gray zone between advanced cynodonts and primitive mammals, and paleontologists debate exactly where to place the group's boundary along that series. The characters defining mammals, including the specific middle ear structure with 3 tiny bones, the lower jaw composed of a single bone, and the type of jaw joint, evolved in sequence along several lineages of late cynodonts. The first true mammals we know from fossils were small, mostly mouse or squirrel-sized, though some reached the size of a domestic cat. They probably lived in nocturnal niches that the Triasic's large reptiles did not efficiently exploit, using the darkness to hunt insects and small animals. Their small size, which was a disadvantage in terms of access to large ecological niches, was an advantage in terms of their caloric needs and their ability to hide from predators. The cynodonts, the advanced therapsids from which the first mammals evolved, are especially fascinating animals because they show in the fossil record the sequence of evolutionary changes that led to mammals. It is one of the best examples in all of paleontology of a transition documented step by step in time. The Thrinaxodon, an early Triassic cynodont from South Africa, already had teeth differentiated into incisors, canines, and postcanines. It had ribs only in the thoracic region, not in the lumbar region as in most reptiles, suggesting it already had a muscular diaphragm, a mammalian characteristic. The bones of its long limbs have a texture suggesting rapid growth, possibly indicating a more active metabolism than cold-blooded reptiles. During the entire age of the dinosaurs, for 180 million years, mammals remained small and mostly discrete. They evolved into diverse forms, including some that specialized in swimming, gliding, burrowing, and other lifestyles. But they never reached the large sizes their descendants would reach after the dinosaurs' extinction. The age of large mammals was waiting for its moment, stored in the genetic code of those small nocturnal Triassic animals. When the dinosaurs disappeared 66 million years ago, the mammals that had survived in the shadows for 180 million years suddenly found themselves in a world with empty ecological niches of every size. The evolutionary explosion that followed produced, in a few million years, all the major groups of mammals we know today, including the primates that would eventually produce humans. But let us go further back. The Gorgonopsids and Dicynodonts of the Permian, the Archosaurs of the Triassic, the first mammals, all of them are animals already on dry land. To find the origins of that land conquest, we have to go back to the Devonian and Carboniferous, the periods preceding the Permian. The story of how the land conquest of vertebrates was discovered and reconstructed is itself a remarkable scientific achievement. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when fossil fish with lobed fins were first found in Devonian rocks, they seemed disconnected from the tetrapods that appeared in younger rocks. The connection between the two was suspected from the similarity of the fin bone structure, but the transitional forms were missing. The evolution of the middle ear of mammals from jaw bones of their synapsid ancestors is documented by one of the most complete fossil sequences in evolutionary biology. In the most primitive synapsids of the Permian, the quadrate and articular bones are large elements of the jaw joint. In progressively more advanced therapsids, those bones become smaller as the dentary expands to take over the jaw joint function. In the most advanced cynodonts of the Triassic, the quadrate and articular are tiny bones still attached to the jaw but already positioned near what will become the ear region. In the first true mammals, those bones have detached completely from the jaw and function as middle ear ossicles. The entire sequence of that transition is documented in fossils, and it is one of the most powerful demonstrations that natural selection can produce complex new structures by modifying pre-existing ones rather than inventing them from scratch. That gap began to fill slowly through the 20th century with the discovery of Ichthyostega and Acanthostega in Greenland, and it filled dramatically with the discovery of the Tiktaalik in 2004. But even that discovery has been complicated by subsequent finds. In 2010, fossil tetrapod footprints were found in Poland dating from 397 million years ago, 8 million years older than the Tiktaalik. That means tetrapods already existed for several million years when the Tiktaalik lived. The Tiktaalik is not a direct ancestor of tetrapods. It is a side branch of the same evolutionary radiation that produced tetrapods, a form that retained more primitive characteristics while other lineages were evolving toward terrestrial life. That story, of the Tiktaalik as tetrapod ancestor that turned out to be a lateral branch after new evidence appeared, is a perfect example of how paleontological science works. Fossils give snapshots of the past, but the family tree connecting those snapshots has to be reconstructed as new evidence appears, and previous reconstructions have to be revised. In science, being revised is not failure. It is the normal process of approaching truth. The Devonian, which lasted from approximately 419 million until 359 million years ago, was the period in which vertebrates made one of the most important steps in the history of life: the transition from water to land. The ancestors of all terrestrial vertebrates were fish. Fish with fins, breathing oxygen dissolved in water through gills. And at some moment in the Devonian, in conditions we still do not fully understand, some of those fish began using their fins in a different way. Lobe-finned fish, the group to which the ancestors of all terrestrial vertebrates belong, had fins with an internal structure of bones that corresponded approximately to the bones of terrestrial vertebrate limbs. That correspondence is not coincidence. It is inheritance. The bones in your arms and legs are modified versions of the bones of those Devonian fish fins. The Tiktaalik, discovered in 2004 in the Canadian Arctic, is the most famous example of that transition. It was a lobe-finned fish from the late Devonian, about 375 million years ago, that had a mobile neck, ribs that could support body weight out of water, and fins with an internal structure similar to the shoulder, elbow, and wrist of a terrestrial vertebrate. It could probably drag itself out of water and move over solid ground for short periods, using its fins as protolimbs. Something about the Acanthostaga, one of the first known tetrapods from the late Devonian of Greenland, caused great surprise when its limbs were studied in detail. Unlike what was expected of an animal in transition between water and land, the Acanthostaga had 8 fingers on each limb, not 5. And its limbs, though definitively tetrapod with the bones of humerus, radius, ulna, and the equivalent of carpal bones, were too weak to efficiently support body weight on land. That suggests the Acanthostaga was primarily aquatic, using its limbs to move along the bottom of shallow rivers or through aquatic vegetation, not to walk on land. The 4-digit limb that for a long time was thought to be the ancestral form from which all 5-digit vertebrate hands derived turned out to be more variable than expected. The Carboniferous saw the diversification of those first tetrapods into multitudes of forms, including the giant amphibians that dominated the ecosystems of the coal swamps. Amphibians several meters in length, with flat wide heads and large jaws, that hunted fish and other animals in the rivers and lakes of those swamp forests. Those Carboniferous amphibians are the most primitive terrestrial vertebrates we know, and are therefore in a broad sense the ancestors of everything that came after, including the dinosaurs, the mammals, and the humans. The conquest of land by vertebrates was not a single or simple event. It was a process that required solving a series of physical and physiological problems that water automatically resolves, but that on land must be solved actively. The first and most obvious was breathing. Fish breathe oxygen dissolved in water through gills. On land, oxygen is in the air, and extracting it requires lungs. Lungs are not an invention of terrestrial vertebrates. Many primitive fish, including modern lungfish, have lungs in addition to gills, probably as an adaptation for surviving in low-oxygen waters. The first tetrapods inherited that lung capacity and developed it. The invention of terrestrial life was not only a vertebrate achievement. It was preceded by the invention of terrestrial plant life, which in turn was preceded by the microbial colonization of rock surfaces. The sequence of terrestrial colonization, from microbes to plants to invertebrates to vertebrates, was not a simple linear progression but a complex web of interactions in which each group both depended on and modified the conditions for the next. The success of the amniote body plan in colonizing terrestrial environments is reflected in the sheer diversity of forms it has produced over 300 million years. From the sail-backed Dimetrodon of the early Permian to the gorgonopsid predators of the late Permian, from the enormous marine ichthyosaurs of the Triassic to the feathered theropods of the Cretaceous, from the whales of the Cenozoic to the bats that navigate by echolocation, all of those animals share the amniote body plan at their core. That same basic architecture, modified by evolution in thousands of different directions, has proven capable of occupying virtually every terrestrial, aerial, and aquatic habitat on Earth. The invention of the amniote egg in the Carboniferous was, in that sense, one of the most consequential events in the history of animal life. Terrestrial plants created the organic matter that terrestrial invertebrates could eat. Terrestrial invertebrates decomposed organic matter and created the soil conditions that more complex plants needed. More complex plants created the forest habitats that vertebrates could exploit. Each step built on the previous steps, creating the conditions for the next. The complex terrestrial ecosystems we know today are not simply the product of individual evolutionary innovations, but of millions of years of ecological interactions between plants, invertebrates, fungi, and vertebrates, all modifying each other and the physical environment they shared. When the first tetrapods left the water in the late Devonian, they entered a world that already had soils built by plant roots and fungi, a world with food webs among invertebrates, a world with shelter in the form of fallen logs and leaf litter. They did not colonize bare rock. They colonized an ecosystem that, though far simpler than today's, was already a functioning terrestrial community. The vertebrate contribution to that community was predation of the large invertebrates, the processing of larger organic material, and eventually the development of herbivory that drove the evolution of plant defenses that in turn drove new insect specializations in an escalating coevolutionary spiral that continues today. The second problem was body weight support. In water, buoyancy counteracts much of the effect of gravity, and fish can have large heavy bodies without needing especially robust skeletons. On land, all body weight rests on the limbs, and supporting it requires denser bones and more powerful musculature. The first tetrapods had relatively weak limbs for their body size, which limited their ability to move efficiently on land. The refinement of limbs for terrestrial locomotion was a process that took tens of millions of years. The third problem was desiccation. An aquatic organism can freely lose water through its body surface without consequences, because the surrounding water replaces what is lost. On land, losing water is fatal. The first tetrapods had to stay moist and return to water to avoid drying out. Their skins were not waterproof like those of modern reptiles. Modern amphibians, which are the most direct descendants of those first tetrapods, still have that problem. They need to stay moist and in most cases reproduce in water. There is an aspect of the land conquest that is rarely mentioned, but that has enormous importance. The conquest of land by vertebrates was not the first conquest of land by complex life. Arthropods, the group including insects, spiders, centipedes, and crustaceans, colonized land before the vertebrates, and when the first amphibians left the water they already found a terrestrial world with established arthropod ecosystems. The first known terrestrial arthropods date from more than 430 million years ago, in the late Silurian, more than 60 million years before the first late Devonian tetrapods. When the first fin-bearing fish began venturing out of the water, arthropods were already waiting for them on land. The presence of a land arthropod community before vertebrates may have been a factor that facilitated the terrestrial conquest by vertebrates. The arthropods would have established primitive food webs with terrestrial plants and decomposing organic material, creating a base of available resources for any vertebrate that could access them. An amphibian that could leave the water and hunt the abundant arthropods living on riverbanks would have access to a rich food resource that its aquatic competitors could not exploit. The fourth and perhaps most important problem was reproduction. Fish and primitive amphibians lay eggs in water, where embryos develop surrounded by liquid. On land, eggs would desiccate unless protected by an impermeable covering. The evolutionary solution was the amniote egg, a type of egg with an amniotic membrane that creates a watery environment around the embryo even though the egg is on dry land. Reptiles, dinosaurs, birds, and mammals are all amniotes, descendants of the group that invented that egg in the Carboniferous. While vertebrates were solving the problems of life on land during the Devonian and Carboniferous, the seas continued to be the richest and most diverse ecosystems on the planet. The Permian oceans in particular sheltered communities of organisms of a complexity rivaling any modern coral reef. The Cambrian explosion, that remarkable event 540 million years ago when most major animal body plans appeared in the fossil record within a geologically brief span of tens of millions of years, produced not only the groups that would eventually lead to the vertebrates and the arthropods but also dozens of groups with no surviving descendants. The Cambrian seas were populated by animals unlike anything alive today, body plans that were tried out by evolution and then discarded, evolutionary experiments that ran for millions of years and then ended without issue. The seas of the Permian were also the birthplace of some of the fish lineages that are most familiar to us today. The ancestors of the ray-finned fish, the group that includes virtually all the familiar modern fish from salmon to tuna to clownfish, were already diversifying in Permian seas. Though those early ray-finned fish were quite different from their modern descendants in many details of anatomy. The basic architecture that would eventually produce the enormous diversity of modern fish was already in place. Permian ray-finned fish were already sufficiently diverse to have colonized both marine and freshwater environments, a pattern that continues in their descendants today. The fish you might see in an aquarium or catch in a river are in a real sense survivors of the Permian world, the members of a lineage that passed through the most devastating extinction in Earth's history and emerged to become the most diverse group of vertebrates on Earth. The hallucigenia, mentioned earlier, was eventually understood to be a lobopodian, an ancestor of modern velvet worms, but in an earlier form so different from modern representatives that paleontologists initially mounted it upside down, thinking its spines were legs and its legs were defensive spines. The Anomalocaris, initially reconstructed from isolated mouthparts that were mistaken for a shrimp and isolated grasping appendages that were mistaken for another animal, turned out to be a half-meter predator with compound eyes giving it near 360-degree vision, the apex predator of Cambrian seas. The Opabinia, with its 5 eyes and flexible clawed proboscis, belongs to no known modern group. Those Cambrian animals are reminders that the body plans we know today are not the only solutions evolution has found to the problems of life, only the ones that happen to survive to the present. The Permian reefs were built primarily by calcareous sponges and bryozoans, not by the corals that build modern reefs. Rugose and tabulate corals, which had dominated Paleozoic reefs since the Ordovician, were still present, but their diversity had decreased since their peak in the Devonian. In contrast, Permian sponges reached unprecedented diversities and abundances, producing reef structures of several tens of meters in height and kilometers in extent. The trilobites deserve special mention in any history of life before the dinosaurs. They are perhaps the most iconic fossils of the Paleozoic world, appearing in the Cambrian more than 500 million years ago and living for approximately 270 million years, until they went extinct in the Permian-Triassic extinction. During those 270 million years, trilobites diversified into thousands of species with a morphological variety that still surprises specialists. There were trilobites the size of a fingernail and trilobites more than 70 centimeters long. Some had enormous compound eyes with hundreds of lenses. Others were blind, living in deep water or burrowing into sediment. In the reef structures and the open seas surrounding them lived organisms of all the main Paleozoic groups. Brachiopods, which superficially resemble bivalves but are internally completely different, were one of the most abundant and diverse groups of the Permian seas. Crinoids, relatives of starfish with bodies mounted on long stalks anchored to the bottom, formed meadows that covered large areas of seafloor. Ammonites, cephalopods with coiled spiral shells, swam in all the seas in forms that varied from coin-sized to more than 2 meters in diameter. The Dunkleistos, a massive armored placoderm fish from the Devonian that could reach 6 meters in length and had a crushing bite with its bony jaws, was one of those apex predators of the pre-dinosaur marine world that no popular prehistory documentary ever seems to cover. It was the great white shark of its era, the top predator of Devonian seas for tens of millions of years. And then it disappeared in the late Devonian mass extinction, the second of the Big Five, which eliminated approximately 75% of species. All that Permian marine world was decimated by the Permian-Triassic extinction. The reef-building sponges nearly completely disappeared. The brachiopods, which had been one of the most abundant groups of Paleozoic seas for hundreds of millions of years, were reduced to a few species that have survived with little diversity to today. The crinoids suffered enormous losses. The trilobites, which had existed in forms very similar to current ones for more than 400 million years and had survived all previous extinctions, including the Permian-Triassic, disappeared completely in that event. What emerged from that extinction was a completely different marine world, with new types of reef builders, new dominant groups, a new architecture of marine ecosystems that would be the foundation of the Mesozoic world. Earth's climate before the dinosaurs was so variable and extreme in some periods that it is difficult to imagine from the perspective of the current world. The 100 million years preceding the appearance of the dinosaurs, from the late Carboniferous to the late Triassic, saw the planet pass through one of its most intense glaciations, through a period of extreme post-extinction heat, and through a gradual recovery toward more moderate conditions. The climate of the Triassic was also shaped by the ongoing breakup of Pangaea, which began during that period. The first rift valleys that would eventually become the North Atlantic began forming in the late Triassic, and the volcanic activity associated with that rifting contributed to the warming that characterized much of the period. As rifts widened into narrow seas, coastal environments became more humid and vegetation more abundant in the regions bordering the new waterways, even as the interior of the supercontinent remained arid and extreme. The polar regions during the Triassic were very different from today's. With no permanent ice caps and warmer global temperatures, the high-latitude regions of Pangaea were forested rather than icy. Fossils of Triassic dinosaurs and other reptiles have been found in rocks that were deposited at high latitudes, indicating that even the polar regions of the Triassic world were accessible to ectothermic or near-ectothermic animals. That contrasts sharply with today, where high latitudes are accessible only to warm-blooded animals with substantial insulation. The warm polar Triassic world was another of the many ways in which the planet before the dinosaur era resembled nothing in today's experience. The extreme warmth of the Triassic also meant that sea levels were generally higher than today, because warmer oceans expand thermally and because there was no polar ice to lock up water as ice. Higher sea levels flooded low-lying coastal areas, creating extensive shallow marine environments that were favorable for the evolution of new marine groups. The Epiric seas, shallow inland seas covering parts of continental interiors, were widespread in the Triassic and provided enormous areas of shallow warm habitat. Those shallow seas were among the most productive marine environments of the Triassic, hosting the new coral reefs, the early ammonite diversification, and the marine reptile evolution that characterized the Triassic seas. Those gradients of humidity, from the humid coasts of the developing rifts to the arid interior of Pangaea, created a diversity of habitats and microenvironments that may have been one of the factors driving the evolutionary diversification of Triassic vertebrates. Different groups specialized for different parts of that gradient. Phytosaurs and other aquatic predators exploited the rivers and lakes of the humid zones, while more drought-tolerant Aetosaur and other groups ranged further into the drier interior. The early dinosaurs of the late Triassic appear to have been most common in the seasonal, semi-arid environments of intermediate humidity, where their efficient locomotion and possibly higher activity levels compared to cruritarsans may have given them advantages. The glaciation of the late Carboniferous and early Permian is the oldest glaciation for which we have clear evidence after the Precambrian glaciations. It occurred when the Gondwana continental masses, which included what are today South Africa, India, Australia, South America, and Antarctica, were situated over the South Pole. The result was a southern hemisphere glaciation of considerable extent, with ice sheets that at some moments covered large parts of those continents. The extreme heat that followed the Permian-Triassic extinction was an extreme in the opposite direction. global temperatures rose several degrees above current levels, and the surface waters of tropical oceans reached temperatures of 40 degrees or more, values that are above the tolerance threshold of most complex marine organisms. Those high water temperatures, combined with low dissolved oxygen concentrations, contributed to making early Triassic seas as hostile to marine life as the fossil evidence shows. The study of that climate before the dinosaurs has undergone a revolution in recent decades thanks to the development of new geochemical techniques allowing reconstruction of ancient atmospheric temperature and composition with previously impossible precision. Oxygen isotope analysis of fossil organism shells allows paleoclimatologists to reconstruct sea water temperatures in those eras. Applied to Permian fossils, that technique has confirmed the extreme warming of the early Triassic and quantified temperature changes during the extinction. Those same techniques have revealed that carbon dioxide levels before the dinosaurs were considerably higher than today's in most periods, and that global temperatures were generally warmer. The effect of the Permian-Triassic volcanic event on ocean chemistry was especially devastating for organisms that build their structures with calcium carbonate: the shells of bivalves and gastropods, the skeletons of corals, the plates of echinoderms. The ocean acidification produced by volcanic carbon dioxide dissolved in the water makes calcium carbonate dissolve, impeding the formation and maintenance of calcareous structures. That effect of ocean acidification on calcifying organisms is exactly the mechanism scientists study today as a consequence of the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide produced by human activities. The Permian-Triassic extinction, caused in part by the same mechanism but with a far more severe acidification, is the closest geological example to what could occur if current ocean acidification continues unchecked. The Triassic was overall a warm period, without permanent ice at the poles, with a continental climate extreme in Pangaea's interior but relatively stable on the coasts. Temperatures were gradually decreasing throughout the Triassic as the Siberian Traps volcanoes went quiet and the carbon cycle returned to balance. By the late Triassic, when the first dinosaurs already existed, the climate was warm but not as extreme as in the early Triassic. The late Triassic ended with a mass extinction. Not as devastating as the Permian-Triassic, which was the worst of the last 500 million years, but severe enough to eliminate most of the large cruritarsans that had dominated the Triassic and to completely reorganize Pangaea's terrestrial ecosystems. The conodonts, those small marine organisms with phosphatic teeth that had existed since the Cambrian and that are extraordinarily useful as guide fossils for dating Paleozoic and early Triassic rocks, went extinct definitively at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. With them disappeared one of the longest-lived lineages in the history of animals, having survived every previous extinction, including the Permian-Triassic. Their extinction at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary is one of the clearest markers of that event in the marine record. Paleontologists studying the Triassic-Jurassic extinction have found that some groups of organisms actually diversified across the boundary rather than suffering losses. The frogs and other amphibians, for example, show increased diversity in early Jurassic rocks compared to late Triassic rocks in some regions. Certain groups of bivalves expanded rather than contracted. Even among the reptiles, some groups show continuity across the boundary with little apparent disruption. Those patterns of partial selectivity, where some groups suffer catastrophic losses while others survive unaffected or even expand, are typical of mass extinction events and reveal that the selective forces of extinctions are not random. They favor certain body sizes, certain metabolic strategies, certain ecological generalists over specialists, certain geographic ranges, in patterns that tell us something about the nature of the stresses producing the extinction. The fauna that emerged after the Triassic-Jurassic extinction was in many respects the starting point of the world most people already know from prehistory, the Jurassic world with its giant sauropods and large theropods. The dinosaurs that dominated the Jurassic did not appear suddenly. Their lineages already existed in the late Triassic, but were constrained by competition with cruritarsans. When the cruritarsans disappeared, the dinosaurs expanded into the vacated niches. That expansion was especially dramatic in the case of the sauropods, the long-necked dinosaurs. In the Triassic, the sauropodomorphs, the lineage leading to the sauropods, were relatively small and not especially prominent animals. In the early Jurassic, after the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, they began a diversification that in barely 20 million years produced the largest land animals that have ever existed. The Brachiosaurus, the Diplodocus, the Apatosaurus, all those Jurassic giants are descendants of the small sauropodomorphs of the Triassic that survived the extinction while their crurotarsan competitors did not. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction occurred approximately 201 million years ago, at the boundary between the Triassic and the Jurassic. It was an extinction affecting both marine and terrestrial ecosystems. In the sea, approximately half of all marine species were lost, including many groups of bivalves, brachiopods, and reef-building organisms. On land, the large crurotarsans nearly completely disappeared. The most probable cause was, again, massive volcanism. In this case, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, an episode of intense volcanism associated with the opening of the North Atlantic when North America began separating from Europe and Africa. That volcanism released large quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, producing global warming and ocean acidification that, though less extreme than those of the Permian end, were sufficient to devastate ecosystems. The dinosaurs survived that extinction remarkably well. Some dinosaur species disappeared, but the group as a whole passed through the Triassic-Jurassic boundary with moderate losses. Their main competitors, the large crurotarsans, did not fare the same. When the dust settled and ecosystems began recovering, the dinosaurs found themselves without large-sized competitors in terrestrial ecosystems. The extinction of the Triassic-Jurassic was the event that converted dinosaurs from secondary animals into the planet's dominators. Without that extinction, the crurotarsans would have continued occupying large ecological niches, and the dinosaurs would have remained in the margins. The age of the dinosaurs was partly a gift from the extinction of their competitors. What followed was one of the most spectacular evolutionary explosions in the history of life. During the early and middle Jurassic, the dinosaurs diversified at an extraordinary rate, filling all the ecological niches the crurotarsans had left vacant. The sauropods began their path toward the gigantic sizes they would reach in the late Jurassic. The theropods diversified into forms of every size, from giants like Dilophosaurus to small insect hunters. The ornithischians, the group that would produce horned dinosaurs, plated dinosaurs, and duck-billed dinosaurs, began their own radiation. The stage was set for the world that most people already know. The first dinosaurs of the late Triassic are in many ways the most interesting from an evolutionary standpoint, though they are rarely the most visually spectacular. They were dinosaurs in their most primitive form, before evolution took them to the gigantic sizes and extreme specializations of the Jurassic and Cretaceous. Studying those first dinosaurs, we can see the basic body plan from which all later forms emerged. The distribution of early Triassic dinosaurs across Pangaea tells us something interesting about the rate of evolution during that period. When the first dinosaurs appear in the fossil record of the late Triassic, they appear in multiple locations around the globe almost simultaneously in geological terms. Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus in Argentina are dated to approximately 231 to 228 million years ago. Similar-aged primitive dinosaurs appear in North America, Africa, Europe, and Asia within just a few million years of each other. That near-simultaneous appearance in geographically dispersed locations suggests one of two things. Either the dinosaur ancestor evolved in one place and spread very rapidly across Pangaea because of its locomotor and ecological advantages, or the characteristics defining the dinosaur lineage evolved nearly simultaneously in multiple populations of a widespread proto-dinosaur ancestor. The evolutionary radiation that produced the dinosaur body plan left traces not only in the dinosaurs themselves, but in their sister groups. Studying the pterosaurs, the earliest of which appeared at roughly the same time as the first dinosaurs in the late Triassic, reveals features of the ancestral ornithodontan body plan that both lineages inherited. Both pterosaurs and the earliest dinosaurs show evidence of hollow bones, at least in some skeletal elements. Both show modifications of the ankle joint that improved locomotor efficiency. Both show evidence of at least some degree of elevated metabolism compared to typical reptiles. Those shared features suggest that the common ancestor of pterosaurs and dinosaurs, before the two lineages diverged, was already a physiologically active animal with features facilitating the energetically demanding lifestyles that both groups would pursue. Resolving that question requires finding even older dinosaur fossils, or better preserved early dinosaur ancestors, a challenge that paleontologists are actively working on. Every year, new fossil sites in the late Triassic rocks of South America, Africa, and Asia produce new specimens that refine our understanding of when and where the first dinosaurs evolved. The story of dinosaur origins is one of the most actively researched questions in vertebrate paleontology, and the picture changes regularly as new discoveries are made. Tonight's understanding of where and when dinosaurs first appeared is certainly more accurate than what was understood 30 years ago, and will likely be refined further by discoveries that have not yet been made. Dinosaurs are characterized by a series of specific anatomical features distinguishing them from other reptiles. The most functionally important is the fully upright stance. Dinosaurs walked with their limbs directly beneath the body, like mammals and birds, rather than having limbs projecting sideways like most modern reptiles. That upright posture is more energetically efficient for locomotion and allows larger body sizes without the metabolic cost the same body mass would carry in an animal with a sprawling posture. The early dinosaurs of the late Triassic, those of South America, North America, Africa, Europe, India, and China, all existed because Pangaea was still connected enough to allow free dispersal. A dinosaur that evolved in what is today Argentina could spread across the supercontinent without crossing any ocean, in the same way that today's large African mammals can move across the African continent. When Pangaea began breaking apart and seas started separating the various landmasses, the dinosaurs left on each continental block evolved independently. Geographical isolation is the engine of biological diversification, and the gradation in the similarity of dinosaur faunas from more similar in the Triassic to more different in the Cretaceous is direct evidence that the continents were progressively separating throughout that period. The Esquigualasto Formation of Argentina, also known as the Valley of the Moon for its lunar landscape of eroded clays and sandstones, is one of the richest late Triassic outcrops in the world. In it were found not only the earliest dinosaurs but a complete late Triassic fauna including several groups of cruritarsans, advanced cynodonts, rhynchosaurs, and other period reptiles. The rhynchosaurs, beaked herbivorous reptiles of the Triassic, are in some Esquigualasto sites the most common animals, far more abundant than the dinosaurs. That confirms that late Triassic dinosaurs were not the dominators of their ecosystems but relatively minor animals in a diverse fauna dominated by other groups. The dinosaurs of late Triassic Africa are known primarily from the Elliott Formation in South Africa and Lesotho, and include primitive forms and some of the first sauropodomorphs, the long-necked dinosaur lineage that would dominate the Jurassic. The Chinese Triassic record includes primitive forms and sauropodomorphs from Yunnan province. The simultaneous appearance of early dinosaurs on multiple continents confirms that their initial diversification occurred across the entire supercontinent during the late Triassic, not as a wave spreading from a single point of origin. None of those first dinosaurs would have seemed particularly impressive to any late Triassic observer accustomed to large Rauisuchians. They were secondary animals in ecosystems dominated by other groups. But they had something their competitors did not have, the right morphology to survive what was about to happen. The plant world before the dinosaurs was radically different from what we know today, and that difference had profound consequences for all the animals inhabiting it. The most striking characteristic of that plant world was the complete absence of flowers and flowering plants, the angiosperms, which today dominate virtually all terrestrial ecosystems. Angiosperms did not evolve until the Cretaceous, tens of millions of years after the beginning of the dinosaur era. Before the angiosperms, the land was covered with ferns, conifers, cycads, ginkgos, and seed ferns. The relationship between plants and the animals that ate them before the age of flowering plants was different in character as well as in the specific organisms involved. Modern flowering plants produce an enormous variety of chemical compounds in their leaves, fruits, and seeds. Alkaloids, tannins, terpenes, and hundreds of other molecules, many of which serve as defenses against herbivores or as attractants for pollinators and seed dispersers. The coevolutionary arms race between plants and the insects and vertebrates that eat them has been producing new plant chemistry and new animal adaptations for consuming that chemistry for more than 100 million years. The relationship between the vegetation of the pre-dinosaur world and the insects living in it was a coevolutionary story played out over hundreds of millions of years, producing chemical interactions of extraordinary complexity. The secondary compounds that plants produce as defenses against herbivorous insects, the alkaloids, terpenes, and phenolics found in plant tissues, represent the accumulated evolutionary responses of plant lineages to millions of years of insect herbivory. The detoxification enzymes in insect guts represent the accumulated responses of insect lineages to those plant defenses. That chemical arms race, running in parallel with the evolutionary arms race between size and armor in vertebrates, shaped the biochemistry of both plants and insects in ways that are still being documented today. Every bitter taste in food, every chemical that makes one plant toxic and another medicinal, has its origins in that ancient evolutionary conversation between plants and the insects that have been eating them since before the dinosaurs existed. The conifers, cycads, and seed ferns of the Triassic also had their chemical defenses against herbivory, but those defenses had been evolving in a different context, in interaction with different herbivores with different digestive systems. When the first dinosaur herbivores began eating Triassic conifers, they encountered a plant chemistry that had been shaped by tens of millions of years of interaction with Permian therapsid herbivores, Aetosaur, Rhynchosaurs, and the various invertebrates that also fed on those plants. The specific chemical challenges that plant defenses posed to early dinosaur digestive systems were different from those that later dinosaur herbivores would encounter when flowering plants appeared in the Cretaceous. The Permian forests, which followed the exuberant Carboniferous forests once the climate became more arid, were forests of conifers and seed ferns. The Glossopteris, a tree with tongue-shaped leaves growing in the temperate regions of Gondwana, was one of the most characteristic elements of those forests. Its fossils are found in Antarctica, Australia, India, South Africa, and South America, which was one of the first pieces of evidence suggesting that those continents had once been connected. The Triassic forests were equally different from modern forests. Cycads, plants that superficially resemble palms but are actually more primitive than any modern tree, were prominent elements of Triassic landscapes. Ginkgos, of the same primitive genus whose only surviving species is the ginkgo biloba we see today in cities, were also common. The ginkgo biloba tree, with its fan-shaped leaves planted in cities around the world for its resilience, is a living survivor of those Triassic forests. The ginkgo genus has existed in a form very similar to today's for more than 200 million years. When we walk under a ginkgo in an urban park, we are under a tree that a Jurassic dinosaur would have recognized. The history of life before the dinosaurs is, literally, within reach in any city that has ginkgos on its streets. The absence of angiosperms also means that pre-dinosaur ecosystems had no fleshy fruits. Animals could eat conifer and cycad seeds, fern leaves, dead wood, insects, and other animals, but not fruits. That difference in food resource availability influenced what types of animals could evolve and what types of dietary specializations were possible. The Bonnetatalians, an extinct group of plants that superficially resembled cycads but had much more complex reproductive structures, with rudimentary flowers that some researchers consider possible precursors to true flowers, flourished during the Triassic and Jurassic and were one of the most abundant plant groups of the early Mesozoic, before being gradually replaced by angiosperms in the Cretaceous. The world of plants before and during the early dinosaurs was not static or simple. It was a world of its own extraordinary diversity, just expressed in forms very different from those we know today. An important consequence of the absence of angiosperms in the pre-dinosaur world that is rarely mentioned is the different nutrient distribution in ecosystems. Modern flowering plants produce fruits rich in sugars and seeds rich in proteins and fats as rewards for the animals that disperse their seeds. Those nutritional rewards did not exist in Triassic ecosystems. The herbivores of the Triassic, including the first herbivorous dinosaurs, had to deal with more fibrous and less nutritious vegetation than that offered by modern flowering plants. That could partly explain why the first herbivorous dinosaurs were relatively small compared to the giant sauropods of the Jurassic, which evolved alongside more diverse and more nutritious vegetation. The seas of the Triassic, while dinosaurs were taking their first steps on land, were the scene of an equally dramatic evolutionary story. The Permian-Triassic extinction had emptied the oceans of most of their complex life, and the groups that filled that void during the Triassic were in many cases completely different from those that had dominated before. The Telatosaurs, a group of Triassic marine reptiles whose relationships to other reptile groups have been debated for a long time, are among the less famous but ecologically important inhabitants of Triassic seas. They were active swimmers with elongated bodies and long tails used for propulsion, somewhat reminiscent of modern moray eels in their swimming style, though completely unrelated to them. They lived exclusively during the Triassic and went extinct with the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, leaving as the only surviving representatives of Triassic marine reptiles the ancestors of the plesiosaurs that would dominate the Jurassic. The Triassic also saw the evolution of the first members of several invertebrate groups that are abundant in modern oceans. The first modern-type corals, the scleractinian corals, appeared in the early to middle Triassic, approximately 10 million years after the Permian-Triassic extinction eliminated the ancient rugose and tabulate corals that had built Paleozoic reefs. The scleractinians are the corals that build today's reefs in the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. Their Triassic ancestors were relatively simple reef builders compared to their modern descendants, but they had already developed the symbiotic relationship with photosynthetic algae called zooxanthellae that is central to coral reef ecology today. That symbiosis, in which the coral provides shelter and carbon dioxide to the algae and the algae provides photosynthetically produced sugars to the coral, was one of the key innovations that made modern coral reefs possible. The overall ecological structure of Triassic seas was quite different from both the Paleozoic seas that preceded them and the Mesozoic seas that followed. The Permian-Triassic extinction had eliminated the dominant Paleozoic groups, including the rugose corals, the blastoids, the fusulinid foraminifera, and many others. The recovery groups of the Triassic built a different kind of ecosystem, dominated by new types of reef builders, new groups of mollusks, and new marine vertebrate predators. By the late Triassic, marine ecosystems had recovered much of their pre-extinction complexity, but organized around different species and different ecological relationships than those of the Permian. That rebuilt marine ecosystem of the late Triassic would be the foundation for the rich Jurassic seas that would give us the ammonite and belemnite beds, the plesiosaur and ichthyosaur faunas, and the coral reefs that we know from that era. Ichthyosaurs are perhaps the most fascinating inhabitants of the Triassic seas. They evolved from a terrestrial ancestor, probably a reptile living on Triassic coasts that was progressively venturing further into the sea, in a convergent process with the one that produced cetaceans much later in history. By the end of that process, ichthyosaurs had developed a body form so similar to that of fish and dolphins that it is hard to believe their ancestors walked on land. The earliest ichthyosaurs of the early Triassic were relatively primitive forms with bodies still somewhat angular and limbs still recalling those of a terrestrial reptile though already modified for swimming. By the late Triassic, Ichthyosaurs had reached highly specialized forms and gigantic sizes. The Shastasaurus, the largest known ichthyosaur, could reach 21 meters in length. The Placodonts were another peculiar group of Triassic seas, marine reptiles specialized in eating bottom mollusks. They had flat, robust teeth designed for crushing the shells of bivalves and gastropods, and some groups developed bony armor over the body that made them superficially similar to turtles, though they were not related to them. The Nothosaurs were more generalist relatives that hunted fish in the coastal waters and could move both on land and in water, though more specialized for the marine environment. The Triassic seas also witnessed the emergence of a group that today dominates the modern oceans, the Neopterygian bony fish. Bony fish, which today represent the great majority of known fish species, began their modern diversification in the Triassic after the losses they suffered in the Permian-Triassic extinction. During the Triassic, those fish were still relatively primitive and unspecialized compared to their Jurassic and Cretaceous descendants, but they had already taken the first step in the diversification that would make them the dominant group of modern oceans. The sharks of the Triassic are another example of continuity between the pre-dinosaur world and the current one. Sharks have been existing in a form very similar to the current one for more than 400 million years, and survived without major changes in their basic body plan through the Permian-Triassic extinction. The sharks inhabiting Triassic seas would be recognizable to any modern diver, though the individual species were different. They are, in the most literal sense, living fossils of the pre-dinosaur world. The extinction of the Triassic-Jurassic profoundly affected marine reptiles. The ichthyosaurs survived, though with reduced diversity, and continued to be prominent elements of Jurassic and early Cretaceous seas. The Placodonts and Telatosaurs did not survive. The Nothosaurs neither. What emerged from the Triassic in the seas was a marine reptile fauna different from that of the late Triassic, dominated by surviving ichthyosaurs and by the plesiosaurs that rapidly diversified in the early Jurassic. There is a mental exercise that can completely transform the way you experience the history of life before the dinosaurs. It consists of trying to represent to yourself how much time is that before. Non-avian dinosaurs existed for approximately 180 million years, from 230 million to 66 million years ago. That period is so long that the distance between the first dinosaur and the last is greater than the distance between the last dinosaur and us. If you compressed the entire history of the dinosaurs into one calendar year, we would be on day 365, but the first dinosaurs would be in January. One of the most important things the history of life before the dinosaurs teaches us is that the current state of Earth's biodiversity is neither inevitable nor permanent. The specific combination of species that exist today, the ecological relationships that connect them, the climates and habitats that support them, are the product of a very specific historical path through time. Different extinctions at different moments could have produced a completely different present. If the Permian-Triassic extinction had been slightly less severe, the synapsids might have continued dominating terrestrial ecosystems, and the archosaurs might never have found the ecological space to diversify into dinosaurs. If the Triassic-Jurassic extinction had not occurred, the Crurotarsans might have continued holding the large-body ecological niches that dinosaurs eventually filled. The concept of deep time, the scientific recognition that Earth's history extends billions of years into the past, was itself a revolutionary idea that had to overcome cultural and intellectual resistance before becoming accepted. When James Hutton proposed in the late 18th century that rocks required millions of years to form, based on his observations of Scottish geology, the dominant view was that Earth was only a few thousand years old. Hutton's famous conclusion that he saw no vestige of a beginning and no prospect of an end in the geological record was a statement that the time scales visible in rock were incomprehensibly vast compared to any human framework. The history of science's discovery of deep time is also a lesson in how knowledge changes human self-understanding. Before deep time was established, the universe felt small and recent, a creation of a few thousand years in which human history occupied a significant fraction of all of time. After deep time was established, the universe expanded to billions of years, and human history shrank to an imperceptible instant at the end of an immense story. That reorientation in human self-understanding was, arguably, as significant as the Copernican revolution that moved Earth from the center of the universe to one planet among many orbiting one star among billions. The recognition of deep time changed everything it touched. Once geologists established that the Earth had existed for hundreds of millions of years, the idea that species could change over that time became conceivable. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection required deep time to work, millions of years of gradual change accumulating into the dramatic differences between species that we see today. The geological deep time that Hutton and his successors established was the foundation on which Darwin built. The Gorgonopsids and the Triassic dinosaurs, the entire world before the dinosaurs that we have explored tonight, exist only within that framework of deep time. The dinosaurs themselves are not a necessary outcome of evolution. They are a contingent one, the product of specific historical events, specific geographical circumstances, specific ecological interactions, and specific extinction events that together happen to produce the conditions for their emergence and success. The same is true of the mammals that succeeded them, and of the primates within the mammals, and of the humans within the primates. We are the product of a very long series of contingent events, each of which could have gone differently. That does not make our existence any less real or any less remarkable. If anything, it makes it more remarkable, because it reveals the improbability of the path that led here. Now, before the first dinosaurs, there are another 220 million years of terrestrial vertebrates, from the first late Devonian tetrapods. That is more time than the entire dinosaur era. And before the first terrestrial vertebrates, there are another 100 million years to the first fish with skeletons, and before the fish, another 100 million years to the first Cambrian animals with skeletons. And before the Cambrian, 3 billion years of microbial life in which the only type of life that existed was the microbe. A useful way to make geological time somewhat more intellectually manageable is to compress all of Earth's life into a single calendar year. If life began 3,800 million years ago on January 1st, then each month of the calendar equals just over 300 million years of real history. In that scale, the first complex multicellular animals of the Cambrian appear in late November. The first fish with jaws appear in the first days of December. The first terrestrial vertebrates appear in mid-December. The first dinosaurs appear on December 25th. The first modern-type mammals appear on December 27th. The primates appear on December 30th. Modern humans appear at 11 in the evening on December 31st. And the entire recorded history of humanity, from the first cities to today, occupies the last 10 seconds of the year. In that scale, everything we have explored tonight, the Permian, the Triassic, the Gorgonopsids, the first dinosaurs, occupies the last 6 or 7 days of the year. And 94% of the history of life, everything that occurred before, is in the preceding 11.5 months. Carrying that perspective with you changes the way you read the fossil record. When you see in a museum a Tyrannosaurus skeleton and a Gorgonopsid skeleton in the same room, it may seem they are from the same time, the same ancient world. But they are not. Between a Gorgonopsid and a Tyrannosaurus there is more time than between a Tyrannosaurus and you. The before of the dinosaurs is as long and as rich as the dinosaur era itself, just less known. The perspective of geological time also helps understand why animal groups extinct before the dinosaurs are so little known to the general public. It is not simply because they are not interesting. It is because the temporal distance makes their fossils harder to find, harder to preserve in good condition, and in some cases harder to correctly interpret. The sediments containing Permian fossils have been subjected to much more time of compression, heating, erosion, and metamorphism than Cretaceous sediments. But in the places where conditions were favorable for preservation across 250 million years, like the Karoo Basin of South Africa, the fossils can be extraordinarily abundant and well preserved. In the entire history of vertebrates before the dinosaurs, there is a group of animals that rarely receives the attention it deserves, but that was crucial in all terrestrial ecosystems from the Devonian to today: the insects and other terrestrial arthropods. The evolution of social behavior in insects, which today reaches its most elaborate forms in the ants, termites, and bees, also has deep roots in the pre-dinosaur world. Termites, which along with ants and bees are today one of the ecologically most important groups of social insects, evolved from cockroaches probably in the Triassic or early Jurassic. Their role in decomposing wood and cycling nutrients in terrestrial ecosystems has been fundamental ever since, and in tropical forests today termites are responsible for a significant fraction of woody material decomposition. The social organization of termites, which rivals that of ants and bees in its complexity, evolved in the Triassic or Jurassic from the colonial behavior of ancestral cockroaches. Today's termite colonies can contain millions of individuals organized into castes with distinct morphologies and functions: workers, soldiers, reproductive queens, and kings. That level of social complexity requires mechanisms for chemical communication, for division of labor, and for colony-level coordination that represent some of the most sophisticated behavioral systems in the animal kingdom. All of that social sophistication has its ultimate roots in the Triassic world, predating the dinosaurs or evolving alongside their earliest forms. The termite that might be in the walls of a building today is the descendant of a social insect lineage that has been building its intricate societies for approximately 200 million years. The relationship between early insects and the plants they fed on or pollinated was also evolving throughout the period before and during the early dinosaurs. The primitive pollination systems of Carboniferous and Permian plants, based primarily on wind and opportunistic insect visits to collect spores or pollen, were gradually becoming more specialized in the Triassic and Jurassic as insect diversity increased and as plants began producing more specialized attractants. The full coevolution of flowers and insect pollinators, the process that produced the extraordinary diversity of both angiosperms and of the bee, butterfly, and moth groups that pollinate them, would not occur until the Cretaceous. But the groundwork for that coevolution was laid in the insect and plant diversity of the pre-dinosaur and early dinosaur world. Insects were the first animals to lastingly conquer dry land. While vertebrates were still experimenting with limbs and lungs in the late Devonian, there were already primitive insects walking on land more than 400 million years ago. The first insects were wingless, similar in many respects to the collembolans and silverfish you still find today under damp stones. Wings evolved in insects during the Carboniferous, between 340 and 310 million years ago, and that event completely transformed the role of insects in ecosystems. A winged insect can disperse much more quickly, colonize new environments, escape from predators, and access food resources high in plants that wingless insects cannot reach. The evolution of wings was probably one of the factors that drove the explosive diversification of insects during the Carboniferous. Carboniferous giant insects, mentioned earlier, were part of a terrestrial ecosystem in which insects occupied an even more prominent role than they have today. Without small mammals competing with them, without birds hunting them from the air, and with oxygen levels permitting larger bodies, Carboniferous insects filled niches that today are occupied by small vertebrates. Beetles deserve special mention in any history of life before the dinosaurs. They are the group of animals with the greatest number of known species on Earth, with more than 350,000 described species and probably many more to be described. That extraordinary diversity has its roots in the Permian, when the first beetles evolved from more primitive insects. The first Permian beetles were small animals, a few millimeters long, probably eaters of decomposing wood or fungi. Their defining characteristic, the elytra, the hardened forewings protecting the membranous hindwings when not flying, was already present in those primitive forms. That wing protection has long been considered one of the reasons for the beetle's evolutionary success. It allows them to colonize environments that would be destructive for the delicate wings of other insects. Cockroaches also deserve attention in the context of the world before the dinosaurs. Cockroaches are extremely ancient animals, with a body plan recognizably similar to the current one known from the Carboniferous, more than 300 million years ago. Carboniferous cockroaches were abundant in the swamp forests of that era and already had the characteristics that make modern cockroaches so resilient: a flattened body for hiding in cracks, the ability to eat almost any type of organic material, and a tolerance to variable environmental conditions that few insects can match. When the first dinosaurs appeared in the late Triassic, cockroaches had already been around for 170 million years, having survived every mass extinction including the Permian-Triassic. One of the most important evolutionary inventions in the entire history of life on land was the amniote egg. We mentioned it briefly when speaking of the land conquest, but it deserves closer examination because it was the development that truly freed vertebrates from water dependence and allowed them to colonize all terrestrial environments. The evolution of the placenta in eutherian mammals, the group including most modern mammals, was another modification of the amniote reproductive system that occurred during the dinosaur era, after the Triassic. The placenta is essentially a heavily modified version of the amniote egg membranes, adapted for internal rather than external development. The chorioallantoic membrane of the reptile egg became, in placental mammals, the placenta connecting the embryo to the mother's uterus. The amniote body plan's flexibility is demonstrated not only by the terrestrial and aerial forms it has produced but by the multiple independent returns to the sea that occurred throughout the Mesozoic and Cenozoic. The ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, and marine crocodilians of the Mesozoic were all independent reinvasions of the marine realm by the amniote body plan. The whales, sirenians, seals, and sea turtles of the Cenozoic represent still more independent reinvasions. Each time, starting from a terrestrial amniote ancestor, evolution independently found solutions to the problems of aquatic life, streamlining the body, modifying limbs into paddles or flukes, adapting the physiology for diving, shifting sensory systems toward underwater function. That repeated convergent evolution of similar aquatic adaptations from diverse terrestrial ancestors is one of the strongest demonstrations that evolution reliably finds certain solutions when faced with similar environmental challenges. That modification has enormous consequences for the type of offspring a placental mammal can produce. Instead of being limited by the size of the egg it can lay, a placental mammal can supply the developing embryo directly from the mother's metabolism, which in principle allows a much longer gestation period and a much more developed newborn. Human beings, with a brain that at birth is already considerable in size though still incomplete, are the extreme example of what the placental system can produce. The marsupials, which also exist since the Cretaceous, solved the same problem in a different way. A very short gestation period in the uterus followed by a long period of development in the marsupial pouch. That difference in reproductive strategy between placentals and marsupials has consequences for what types of offspring they can produce and what types of parental investment they require. The specific details of modern mammalian reproduction, the hormones, the immune tolerance of the mother for the semi-foreign embryo, the placental architecture, all trace their origins to the evolutionary innovations of the Triassic and Cretaceous cynodonts and early mammals that were working out the details of mammalian reproduction under the shadow of the dinosaurs. Amphibians, the first terrestrial vertebrates, had a fundamental problem limiting their conquest of land. Their eggs needed water to develop. The eggs of an amphibian are small packages of yolk wrapped in a gelatinous membrane, without a waterproof shell protecting them. If laid on dry land, they desiccate rapidly. That means amphibians, despite being able to breathe on land and move on it, have to return to water to reproduce. The amniote egg, which evolved in the Carboniferous approximately 300 million years ago, solved that problem elegantly. An amniote egg has several specialized membranes creating a controlled environment around the embryo. The amniotic membrane wraps the embryo in fluid, giving it the aqueous environment it needs to develop even though the egg is on dry land. The allantois manages the respiratory gases and metabolic waste of the developing embryo. The yolk sac stores the yolk feeding the embryo during its development. And all that is wrapped in the chorion, the outer membrane that in many species is protected by a calcareous or leathery shell, making it resistant to desiccation and predators. The amniotes, the group including reptiles, dinosaurs, birds, and mammals, are all vertebrates having that type of egg. Mammals, which are mostly viviparous, have modified that system so development occurs inside the mother's body rather than in an external egg, but they retain the original amniotic membranes, which in mammals become the placenta and fetal membranes. The very word amnion, that membrane creating the protective fluid sac around a fetus, comes directly from the evolutionary novelty that freed vertebrates from water dependence 300 million years ago. The evolution of the amniote egg was the event that truly converted vertebrates into genuine conquerors of the land. With that egg, they could lay their young in any terrestrial environment, away from water, and the embryo would have everything needed to develop. Deserts, mountains, dry forests, all those environments inaccessible to amphibians became habitable for amniotes. The first amniotes appeared in the late Carboniferous. During the Permian, they diversified into the synapsids that dominated the Permian and into primitive reptiles. And from that diversification eventually came the dinosaurs, the birds, and the mammals, all of them children of that fundamental evolutionary invention that occurred 100 million years before the first dinosaur stepped on Earth. The difference in nitrogenous excretion between reptiles and mammals also traces back to this period. Reptiles, birds, and dinosaurs converted ammonia into uric acid, a relatively insoluble compound that can be excreted with very little water as the white powder we see in bird droppings. Mammals converted ammonia into urea, less toxic than ammonia, and developed concentrating kidneys capable of excreting urea in small quantities of very concentrated water. Those differences in basic physiology of Permian therapsids, the ancestors of mammals, are visible in some aspects of the fossil record. Permian therapsids lived in varied environments, including some relatively arid ones, suggesting they had already solved the problem of water conservation with sufficient efficiency to colonize dry environments. Everything we have explored tonight, the Permian's gorgonopsids, the Triasic's first dinosaurs, the conquest of land by tetrapods, is actually the recent part of life's history on Earth. If we go back further, much further, we arrive at a world so different from the current one that it seems to belong to another planet. The big five mass extinctions of the last 500 million years, the Ordovician, the late Devonian, the Permian-Triassic, the Triassic-Jurassic, and the Cretaceous-Paleogene, are the events that most profoundly reorganized Earth's biodiversity in the Phanerozoic. Each of them eliminated the dominant groups of their time and opened the way for the diversification of groups that before were secondary. Without the mass extinctions, the history of life would have been completely different. The Precambrian Earth, the world for most of which the only life was microbial, was not a uniform or simple place despite lacking complex multicellular organisms. The microbial ecosystems of the Precambrian were diverse and metabolically sophisticated, with different microbial groups occupying different chemical niches. Aerobic and anaerobic bacteria, methane-producing archaea, sulfur-cycling microbes, iron-oxidizing bacteria. All of those groups had their ecological roles in Precambrian ecosystems, modifying the chemistry of their environments and interacting with each other in complex ways. The great oxygenation of the atmosphere, the snowball earth glaciations of the Neo-Proterozoic, the gradual buildup of continental land masses. All of those events occurred in the context of microbial life modifying and responding to its planetary environment. By the time the first animals appeared in the Ediacaran, more than 600 million years ago, the planet had already been fundamentally transformed by billions of years of microbial activity. The animals arrived in a world that microbes had prepared for them. Without the Ordovician extinction, The Paleozoic seas might have continued dominated by the same groups that existed in the Cambrian and Ordovician, and the subsequent diversification of fish and other vertebrates might have occurred in a very different ecological context. Without the Devonian extinction, the lobe-finned fish lineage that produced the first tetrapods might have remained a minor group in fish-dominated seas rather than finding the ecological push that may have encouraged terrestrial ventures. Without the Permian-Triassic extinction, the synapsids would likely have continued dominating terrestrial ecosystems, and the archosaurs and dinosaurs might never have found the ecological space to diversify. Without the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, the Cruritarsans might have continued holding large ecological niches, and the dinosaur diversification of the Jurassic might not have occurred in the same way. And without the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, the small Mesozoic mammals might have remained small indefinitely, never finding the ecological space to evolve into the large diverse forms that eventually produced the primates and ultimately the humans who are now reconstructing the stories of all those extinctions. The Precambrian is the eon spanning from Earth's formation 4.5 billion years ago until 541 million years ago, when the first animals with skeletons appeared in the Cambrian. It covers nearly 90% of all Earth's history, and for almost all of that time the only life that existed was microbial. During the first 500 million years of Earth, there was probably no life at all. Earth was too hot, too heavily bombarded by meteorites, too geologically unstable for life to establish itself durably. The first evidence of life dates to between 3,800 and 3,500 million years ago, and it is microbes, cells without a differentiated nucleus living in the primitive seas. For more than 2 billion years, microbes were the only inhabitants of Earth. And during that time, they made the most profound change in the planet's history: the oxygenation of the atmosphere. Cyanobacteria, photosynthetic microorganisms, began releasing oxygen as a byproduct of that process. At first, that oxygen was absorbed by iron dissolved in the oceans, producing the great iron oxide deposits, the banded iron formations, that today are one of the planet's main mineral resources. But eventually ocean iron was exhausted, and oxygen began accumulating in the atmosphere. That event, the Great Oxidation, occurring approximately 2,400 million years ago, was in many ways the most severe environmental catastrophe in life's history, though it is rarely described as such. Oxygen is a highly reactive and toxic gas for organisms not adapted to handle it. The accumulation of oxygen in the atmosphere was a mass extinction for the anaerobic microorganisms that had dominated Earth for 2 billion years. Only those that found refuge in oxygen-free environments or that evolved mechanisms to tolerate or use oxygen survived. The bacteria and archaea living in rocks several kilometers underground, organisms discovered only in recent decades of geological exploration, are perhaps the most direct living connection to the Precambrian interior world. Those deep subsurface microbes live in pore waters and on rock surfaces at depths and pressures and temperatures where no surface organism could survive. Some of them have metabolisms so slow that they may divide only once every 1,000 years. They live in a world completely isolated from the surface biosphere, powered not by photosynthesis but by chemical reactions between water and rock that have been occurring continuously for millions of years. Some of those organisms may be the direct descendants of microbes living in the rocks of Pangaea when the supercontinent existed, isolated from the surface by kilometers of overlying rock and unchanged by the geological events happening above them. The long road from those first Precambrian microbes to the first dinosaurs is the story of life building complexity progressively, finding new solutions to the problems of existing in a physical world, inventing new types of bodies and new types of metabolisms. Each step on that road depended on all the previous steps. The dinosaurs would not have been possible without the first amniotes. The first amniotes would not have been possible without the first tetrapods. The first tetrapods would not have been possible without the first fish. The first fish would not have been possible without the first Cambrian animals. And none of them would have been possible without the microbes that oxygenated the atmosphere and set the entire story in motion. Tonight we have traveled through an enormous time. From the first Precambrian microbes to the last late Triassic cruratarsans that yielded their place to the dinosaurs. From the first fish with lobed fins beginning to venture out of the water to the first nocturnal mammals hiding in the shadows of the Triassic world. From the giant forests of the Carboniferous to the arid landscapes of the late Permian swept by wind. The darkness before sleep is the darkness of that deep time. The time when gorgonopsids hunted under a sky we would not recognize. The time when the first amphibian looked from the water's edge at a terrestrial world no one had yet stepped on. The time when the first mammals emerged from their burrows at nightfall while dinosaurs slept around them. All that time led here. To this moment. To this instant in which a species of intelligent primate looks back in time and tries to remember what occurred before the dinosaurs arrived. That capacity to look back, to reconstruct worlds that no human eye ever saw from the traces they left in rock, to place ourselves in a story vastly larger than any individual life or any human civilization, is one of the most extraordinary things about being the kind of animal we are. We are made of the same matter that made the gorgonopsids and the trilobites and the Cambrian sea creatures and the first photosynthetic bacteria. The atoms in your body have been through previous stellar fires and previous geological cycles before arriving here. You are not separate from that long history. You are its most recent expression, the latest chapter in a story that began with the first self-replicating molecules in a warm Precambrian sea and that has not yet found its ending. Sleep comes now, and the history of life before the dinosaurs settles into the background from which all things emerge and to which all things return. The world outside is quiet. Somewhere deep in the rock beneath you, the fossils of organisms that lived hundreds of millions of years ago are still there, waiting for the next paleontologist who will read their story. The world goes on. It always has. All that time, all that world that existed before the dinosaurs, is the prologue of the better-known story. It is the story of how the pieces that made the Mesozoic world possible were built. The upright stance, the amniote egg, the archosaur body plan, the active metabolism of the therapsids. Nothing that the dinosaurs were emerged from nothing. It was the result of hundreds of millions of years of accumulated evolutionary experiments, failures and successes, lineages that flourished and went extinct and left their legacies in those that came after. Geological time is generous. Generous in the sense that it gives each evolutionary experiment the space to develop fully before being replaced. The gorgonopsids were not a fleeting accident. They dominated ecosystems for tens of millions of years. The Rauisuchians were not an irrelevant dead end. They were the dominant predators of the Triassic for 40 million years. The ichthyosaurs were not a minor curiosity. They were the dominant marine vertebrates for 150 million years. Each of those groups had its moment. Each of them was the most successful evolutionary solution to the problems of their time. Dinosaurs fascinate us because they are large, spectacular, different from anything we see today. But there is something equally fascinating in the animals that preceded them, precisely because they are less known. The gorgonopsids, those saber-toothed predators that dominated the Permian, are for most people completely unknown. The placodonts, those marine reptiles with flat teeth that crushed shells in the Triassic, are equally mysterious. The giant amphibians of the Carboniferous, hunting in swamps of a world without birds and without mammals and without dinosaurs, are creatures with a strangeness that the dinosaurs can scarcely surpass. The world before the dinosaurs is a reminder that Earth's history of life is much longer, much stranger, and much richer than any popular prehistory account can capture. It is a story that took hundreds of millions of years to build the conditions for the dinosaurs, and then took another 180 million years to arrive at the mammals, and another 66 million to arrive at us. You are the heir of all that time. The carbon in your cells, the calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, all of it has been through previous stellar fires and previous geological cycles before arriving here. Your biological heritage does not begin with the first humans. It begins in the Cambrian seas, passes through the Devonian fish, through the Carboniferous amphibians, through the Permian therapsids, through the Triassic cynodonts, through the small mammals that survived in the shadows of the dinosaur world, and finally arrives here. You are the result of all that time, of all that experiment, of all those deaths and survivals and adaptations that occurred long before the dinosaurs existed. And that, if you think about it in the darkness that precedes sleep, is something that can fill you with calm. The world has been much worse than this. It has survived things much larger than anything we can imagine on our time scale. And here you are, at the end of that long road, with the capacity to remember everything that happened before. If this journey kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are many more worlds waiting to be explored in the dark.